The Israeli government has now confirmed that it intends to take complete control of Gaza City as it further escalates the conflict in the territory. It follows an interview with Fox News yesterday in which Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu outlined plans to take complete control of the entire Gaza Strip.
Will Israel take control of all of Gaza?
We intend to, in order to assure our security, remove Hamas there, enable the population to be free of Gaza, and to pass it to civilian governance.
The plan, which would involve the displacement of many thousands of residents in Gaza City, comes as Israel is already facing growing international pressure to end military operations there and allow humanitarian aid in. Reacting to the latest developments, Sir Keir Starmer said in a statement, the Israeli government's decision to further escalate its offensive in Gaza is wrong, and we urge it to reconsider immediately. What we need is a ceasefire, a surge in humanitarian aid, the release of all hostages by Hamas, and a negotiated solution. Well, to take a look at this situation in a little more detail, I'm joined by Noga Tarnopolsky, an independent journalist based in Jerusalem, and Dr Burcu Ozcelik, a senior research fellow in Middle East security at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Thank you very much for joining us here on ITV News to talk about this. Noga, if I can turn to you first of all, the IDF is already in control of a significant percentage of the Gaza Strip. If we look at the map here, we can see the areas in blue. What is the significance of taking these final areas?
Well, we don't yet know because we haven't actually seen the plan authorized by the Israeli government. What we have in hand right now is the announcement that this plan was approved. But it seems to be a way to pacify some of Prime Minister Netanyahu's most hardline ministers who want to take over the entire Gaza Strip completely, to empty it of their native Gazan population, and to implant Jewish settlements there. They say so openly. The Prime Minister has not gone that far by a long shot, but since the Israeli army is vociferously opposed to this plan and says that it will unnecessarily endanger both Israeli hostages still held in by Hamas and the lives of Israeli soldiers, we can only assume that it's not for a military purpose, but for a political purpose that the government has made this decision.
And while this might satisfy some of the more hardline people within that coalition government, it would, I assume, be fair to say that the majority of the people in Israel and other people in government would be opposed to this.
I don't know about people in this government, but among the citizens of the state of Israel, consistently polls show that around 80% believe that the number one public issue facing the nation is to end the war in Gaza. They support an end, not just a truce or ceasefire, but a solution that would bring this war to an end, with the belief, of course, that that would also secure the release of the remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza. But the government, ignoring obviously international opinion, not just that of Prime Minister Starmer, but of all of Israeli allies, as far as I have been able to count, and ignoring, very importantly, the opinion of its currently serving military chief of staff, intelligence chiefs, and the men who've held those posts for generations back, who've made public statements in recent days, ignoring all of them and the vast majority of the Israeli public, the government has decided to move ahead.
If I can turn to you, Burcu, for a minute, we heard mention of the IDF commanders there. The Israeli forces have been engaged in this conflict for some time now. Will it be an easy operation to take Gaza City?
I don't think it would be. I think there is a high level of risk involved. The chief of the IDF has already mentioned this. There are others as well who have pointed to the severity of the risk, both to the lives of IDF soldiers who would be prosecuting this operation inside Gaza City, as well as potentially, of course, the lives of the remaining Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. One point worth noting is that an urban counter insurgency mission, such as what this would entail, is not compatible with a long-term military occupation. So there is an inconsistency there in terms of what is the long-term military strategy, and will that translate into achieving political objectives set out by the Netanyahu government.
We've seen Israel rolling back on some other conflicts, particularly with Iran lately. Has that been a factor in the timing here, potentially?
I think it's fair to say that the expectation, certainly in the UK and across other European allies of Israel, was that having achieved a certain level of success against Iranian nuclear targets during the recent operation, that this would be a moment of opportunity to begin to wind down the operation in Gaza, that having downgraded Iran's axis of resistance across the Middle East, since the 7th of October attacks, the expectation now was that it wasn't necessarily mission accomplished with respect to the war goals set out by the Netanyahu government in Gaza, but that significant success had been achieved against Hamas, against Hezbollah, and certainly against Iran. And we can argue over the level of success that was achieved against Iranian nuclear sites, but the ability to elicit support from President Trump in the United States to target Iranian military and nuclear sites was seen as a sufficient level of achievement that would then trigger a wind down of operations in Gaza. But we have not seen that happen. If anything, as we've seen since last night, Israel is now looking to expand the operations in Gaza and, in fact, occupy the entirety of the Strip.
We were hearing from Noga about some of the opposition amongst the Israeli people to the continuation of this operation, and in particular, the desire to see the hostages, which are still held in Gaza, returned. Presumably escalating the military action like this represents a risk to the hostages that are there.
Well, that is a fear, and a real fear, I think. We don't know how Hamas might retaliate against a further Israeli incursion into Gaza City. There have been some statements along the lines of how Israel would suffer severely for such an expansion of its operation, its military presence inside Gaza. We do know, however, that the Israeli hostages present Hamas with leverage. And this is a form of leverage that they do not want to use. It allows for them to be continuously engaged in hostage release and ceasefire negotiations. It lends a level of legitimacy to Hamas negotiators. And this is the issue. The Netanyahu government continues to believe that it is only through the exercise of military pressure that the Israeli hostages can be released. And they cite previous release of Israeli hostages successfully achieved through military pressure as evidence for this tactic. The question is, how much longer can this be deployed? Clearly, the hostages are not being released. Ceasefire talks have collapsed. So what other measures can Israel and its allies begin to take to be able to put more pressure on Hamas to release the hostages, given that that is the most important priority from the point of view of the Israeli public? Well, there are other means that could be exercised.
Let's just talk about that a little bit more, because I want to bring Noga back in on this. There is already considerable pressure on Israel from allies and from elsewhere in the world. We heard from Sir Keir Starmer earlier. We've heard moves from some nations towards recognizing a Palestinian state. Does the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is still persisting with this show that this pressure has had no effect?
Well, it certainly shows that this pressure has had no effect, as the pressure of the vast majority of the Israeli public has no effect. But I'm afraid I have to be the one to bring in some Israeli realpolitik to this conversation. The Israeli government, as Burcu was just saying, does continue to claim that only vast military pressure will bring the hostages back. That is completely and totally belied by the facts. Hamas, at the time of its attack on October 7th, 2023, took 251 Israeli hostages. In the almost 2 years since then, 0, to my knowledge, have been brought back through military force, and 8 have been brought back through military rescue operations. That is it. So we're talking about, I mean, an infinitesimal number. And the Israeli government continues to hold on to this position because it is politically convenient for the prime minister, who is now managing, he's unpopular among the people, as we're saying. He's now atop a minority government of 49 out of 120 Knesset seats. It's a vulnerable position to be in, even though the parties that have abandoned his government say that they won't vote to topple him. It leaves him in a bad situation. And he needs, almost at any cost, to keep his most hardline extremists on side in order to be sure that he can hold on to power at least until the time of that elections are forced upon him by the limits, which is October 2026. And it does appear that the prime minister is responding to this pressure. His most extremist ministers that include Orit Struk, Bezalel Smotrich, Mr. Elkin of Jerusalem, Ben Gvir, some of these names that have become rather well known, are a collection of ministers with almost no previous ministerial experience and literally no military experience. So you have a finance minister and a minister for national security who until very recently were themselves subjects of very serious police investigations for terror links, for hate crimes themselves. They now seem to be the ones dictating Israeli military policy. And in this regard, one of the quotes we've already gotten from last night's long and stormy cabinet meeting was that the chief of staff of the army, who has publicly said he opposes this move, he does not recommend it, and he doesn't believe it has military justification, he told the ministers, why don't you erase the return of hostages as one of the war aims? That is what he believes should happen, because the hostages, it is believed by all of the authorities in charge, will be killed as part of this Israeli advance.
Just to go back to some of the pressure which could be brought onto the Netanyahu government, Burcu, in terms of Israel's military, how dependent are they on supplies from elsewhere? You know, in a logistical sense, is there any pressure that people could put on Israel?
Well, the UK has been putting pressure on Israel. For many, of course, it's not a sufficient level of pressure. Israel is most predominantly dependent on American military aid. And I think the Israeli thinking there is that as long as they have President Trump and Congress on side, that they can continue to prosecute the operation in Gaza in the way that they envision it in terms of the Netanyahu government and his far-right coalition. There are further steps that could be taken, and there has been some pressure upon the UK government to completely employ a trade embargo to stop all forms of military cooperation and intelligence sharing. There has been news that Israel is planning to or threatening to cut off defense and security ties with the United Kingdom, specifically in the area of intelligence cooperation. Of course, there are close and have been historically close bilateral ties in this regard. There are other steps that the UK and its European allies can take to put more pressure upon the Netanyahu government, particularly as we've reached this point now, which could be a point of no return in terms of the Palestinian people and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the ongoing and unacceptable level of suffering there should the Gaza occupation plan go ahead. There are, however, also pressure points that can be potentially exerted upon Hamas. Ceasefire talks have sadly failed to date. So what else can be done to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages and to begin to talk about disarmament and the demilitarization of Gaza in more serious terms? What we are lacking still is a plan for the day after. And this is partially, I imagine, a deliberate strategy on the part of the Netanyahu government to not talk about what comes next. During yesterday's deliberations, I understand that there was talk about the need for a transitional interim administration over Gaza that would exclude Hamas, but also exclude the Palestinian Authority. That leaves no governing body potentially for the Palestinians in their continuing struggle for the right to self-determination.
I just want to talk a little bit more about what does come next. If I can go back to Noga for a moment, because in the short term, this potentially, if it goes ahead, will result in the displacement of many thousands of Gazan citizens. But then what does happen after that? We've heard a variety of suggestions ranging from a democratically elected Palestinian government to people talking of holiday resorts being built there. You know, how much can we look at what might follow?
Well, again, the statement put out by the Netanyahu government last night is interesting in this respect, too, because what it says is it's an expression of the fantasy of the Israeli government, which has never been reflected in reality. What it says is that it wants to allow for the emergence of a non-Hamas, non-Palestinian authority, Arab governing structure. What Netanyahu is saying is that he wants Egypt or the United Arab Emirates, somebody else with the legitimacy of being an Arab state, maybe Jordan, basically to take Gaza off his hands once this operation is done. However, we know that the Palestinians want their own representation. The Western world recognizes the Palestinian Authority as the legitimate governing body over all Palestinians in Palestinian territory. And so it is entirely possible that what Netanyahu is doing with some wiles is setting up a situation in which no Arab nation will want to take over or agree to take over Gaza because they say we cannot usurp the Palestinians as an Arab nation, and therefore will leave Netanyahu in a situation in which he can shrug and say, I guess we have to govern it because no Arabs will take it from us. That is a real danger. It is entirely possible from the statement we saw yesterday that this is Netanyahu basically paving the route to a full Israeli occupation, which, again, the majority of Israelis and certainly the Israeli military do not want. But doing so under the guise of looking for some sort of Arab power who will take over in Gaza. We don't really know of other plans. During the period of this war, pan-Arab plans were floated. All of them in some way do connect to the Palestinian Authority, which Netanyahu has long demonized as being as bad as Hamas. We don't know of any American plan beyond the one you just cited, in which Donald Trump suggested emptying Gaza of Gazans and turning it into a Riviera. That never really went beyond that statement. And so my concern when I look at this panorama is that Netanyahu is probably, it seems to me, winking at those among his ministers who overtly want Israel to fully occupy Gaza and resettle it with Jews, winking at them and saying, well, let's create this situation in which no one else will take it from us, and then you can do as you want.
We will have to wait and see exactly what does pan out in the coming weeks and months. Burcu Ozcelik, Noga Tarnopolsky, thank you very much for joining us to talk about this here at ITV News.